I'd like to thank Thor and Gary and the Human Rights Foundation asked me to come in and shorten your noon meal and instead have Putin for lunch. Okay, so now Thor tasked me with trying to get into the mind the psychology of somebody who's very secretive but very public, and for which we don't know much. And also at the end to provide what I would guess to be a model of his brain. If we did some brain imaging, PET or fMRI on him, what his brain would look like based on his traits, okay? Now, there's a caveat here. It's called the Goldwater rule. And the Goldwater rule came in 1964, and it was an edict from the American Psychological Association to all psychiatrists and psychologists saying it is unethical for any clinician to diagnose anybody based on some public information. That is, without actually studying them carefully themselves and getting their agreement to have this published. So a group of Democratic psychiatrists and psychologists, during the presidential election, where Barry Goldwater was up, published a white paper saying he was psychologically unfit to be president, and this kind of destroyed him. And ever since that, they said you can't do this. It was recently done with Trump. There was a group of Democrats, there were psychologists, psychiatrists who said he's not. They diagnosed him, and it's unethical. I didn't vote for Trump, but fair is fair. Nonetheless, we're going to, in some way, violate this immediately by trying to guess, and not by trying to give a categorical diagnosis. That is, this person has this disorder or not, but rather to look at the traits that are well known and about Putin and see what they're consistent with. So that's the job here. Now, one of the problems, it's not only unethical to say this person is diagnostically a psychopath or something else, but it's also fundamental that most of the problems that we get with leaders are people that have personality disorders. There's many kinds of psychiatric disorders, but the personality disorders are lifelong, pervasive behavioral traits that are usually harmful to the person, but definitely to the people around them and even to society. So they're called cluster B type psychiatric disorders. This is where most of the murders come from with people with psychiatric disorders. And it's also where the abuse of one human on the other. And a psychopath is basically a predator of one human on another. Now, without jumping to that conclusion, it's important to know that in order to see that, you can't just look at the traits of somebody, what you see. You have to get inside the person's head. And therefore, you have to talk to this person for days, do structured, unstructured interviews to see what the inner mental workings of the person are, because you can't just tell by the traits. In this way, for example, I'll get to this later, a psychopath and a sociopath do the same thing for very different reasons. Fundamentally different, and their brains are different, and what happened to them is different. And so this is an important distinction. So here are my sources, and some of my sources. I went through about 42 books and read them, generally on dictators for the past 4,000 years, about their traits, even the kind of artwork they liked, and just loony things they did. But individual dictators over the years, tyrants, to get their traits and just to list them, to catalog them over the past 10 years, and take a look to see if there's any consistent pattern there. I also, read numerous articles and academic papers, and over the past several years, interviewed people who oversaw the dissolution of the USSR, 1990-91, and various presidents of Balkan and Baltic countries and within the former SSR, and other people, psychiatrists who know much about this. So I have many sources. I'll try to give you this overall omnibus sort of picture that I have, generally about successful dictators, and then about Putin, we'll guess. Now, most dictators, as it turns out, I'll give you the conclusion, have psychopathic and narcissistic traits. And there's a mix of these things. So they don't seem to be pure psychopaths. And in fact, it's very difficult for somebody who is a pure categorical, clinical psychopath to be the head of anything. You know, you often hear that CEOs of large corporations are psychopaths. They're not. Where you find the psychopaths are in startup companies, CEOs of startup companies. But you don't find, you know, it's the Wolf of Wall Street. It's a real good psychopath. The usual psychopath doesn't kill or rape anybody. They're the Wolf of Wall Street. But it's not in these big corporations. Those guys are usually mensches, actually. In the dictators themselves, it would be, they kind of violate this rule. They can be real psychopaths or have narcissistic personality disorder. So that's where most of the problems lie, or the problems they have with us lie. Now, in the past 30 years, I've studied a lot of psychopathologies. And we use genetic tests, fMRI, PET scans, EEG, and we have all sorts of clinical and psychiatric measures to do this. We put this together, and we're able to really come up with what makes a person tick. In this case, for famous people, for example, famous murderers, I've looked at the brains in depth, a lot of murderers, serial killers, but not the famous ones. The famous ones use the system always. So they never give you their genes. They never give you, you do imaging on them. Same way with dictators. You know, I've been begging people just to get one cell from Putin, you know. That's all we need. We can reconstruct him genetically. I'm sort of just kidding here. I mean, that's sort of, it's unethical, but, you know, I don't know. But anyway, we can still look at the traits and get some sort of consensus look at people who know him and been around him and have studied him and find the traits. And in fact, I asked Thor to print out the traits I'm talking about. That is, the traits of dictators that most all of them have, and also traits of psychopaths and narcissists. And on one sheet, I'll show those later without going through each one. You'll have that. You can go through and score him yourself. You'll be able to score by circling whether he has this strong trait. Now, everybody is going to have some of these traits, right? They're normal traits with a difference. That is, everybody can be glib and charming, salesmen, but we know this. It's part of their job. Everybody has an inflated sense of themselves when they're making a pitch to a new girlfriend or boyfriend. This temporary stuff doesn't count. It's when you do it all the time. You're on the make all the time. That's kind of, if you'd circle that trait. If you are on the make all the time, you have these traits, and you use it to harm people, to use them, manipulate them, and really ends up harming, and you don't care, that's an asterisk. That's a two-pointer, not just a one-pointer. And so you can add these up, but we can look at what people think, especially people who know about him well. Now, I'll have other traits of almost all dictators, and the one thing about them is almost all of them are very smart, and they have very, very good memories. That is, it looks like the upper part of their cortical system, which is called cold cognition. The cold cognition is different than hot cognition, you know, emotions. The cold cognition is very good, and they don't let emotions get in the way. So that makes them even sharper. And many of these people have good memories. Idi Amin was not so smart and did not have such a good memory. He's a special case, but almost all of them are like this. And it's basically, with psychopaths and narcissists, the part of the brain that processes connectivity between people, emotional empathy, is not there. So they don't have to waste time accessing that when they're dealing with it. You know, when you're talking to somebody, you're saying, am I harming this person? Am I leading them astray? Something like that. They don't have to worry about that. So they process very fast, and they seem smarter kind of than they really are, because only half the brain is really working. Now, if we look at, there's an important distinction between traits and a categorical diagnosis. Categorical diagnosis is when you say you have positive symptoms, schizophrenia. You have that disorder or disease. Traits are what everybody can have that you kind of add up in trying to diagnose something. So everybody will have these traits, and these personality traits are determined genetically. So this is a large part of who you are. It is genetic, and this is something we've really gotten to appreciate in the past 5 years that we didn't think before. It's another way of saying Plato was right and Aristotle was wrong, okay? And so we are born with a sense of morality. We are born with a sense of beauty and all that. We come with a whole package of brain circuits ready to fire, and we're just fine-tuning them. So, but how much of each trait we have depends on the form of the gene, the allele that we get from our mothers and fathers, and how these add up. And for every complex adaptive trait you have, there's about 350 for humans. There's about 15 genes and gene regulators that determine that. It's not one. You know, we talk about a warrior gene. There's really about 15 warrior genes. And how they work in concert in the casino of genetic mixing when you're conceived determine largely your personality. But this is different in the case of somebody who's got the same traits, but they have a personality disorder. I'll show you why. So here are three people on the left, the middle, and the right. And they all have a different dosing of genes that control aggression. Okay, these are the warrior genes. And the person on the left, from their mother and father, inherited the forms of these genes that make you very calm and non-competitive. Somebody who doesn't care. You know, you play a game with somebody, and they just care whether they're winning or not. This is normal. This is people very mellow about it. And then there are people way on the right. And these are the people that always have to, for example, win in chess games. They're not pathological, but they're wired to have to win, you know? And I come from a family where even the grandkids are very, very competitive, and they all have these, a big dose, and a lot of them are passed from the mothers to the sons, but they also to the granddaughters. And we all are awful to play, like Scrabble with, so we can only play with ourselves because we're so obnoxious. Everybody always has to win. I wouldn't even let my grandson beat me in Scrabble. So it can get pathological. But so you can find this in normal people, but it's different with somebody with a personality disorder. And here's a really key point. Almost virtually every dictator that I studied, and certainly all the killers, serial killers, murderers, pedophiles, everything that I've studied with intensive techniques, all had early trauma or were abandoned, which is a trauma. And this is especially bad in the years between birth and 3 years old about. And then the effect of that goes, the effect of trauma and abuse, bullying, it goes less and less as you get older. It still has an effect, but it kind of degrades. So every single one of them had this. What does that do? It turns out the bottom line of this, which is probably the main point here, is that those people that are abused early, traumatized, and who are genetically wired with these susceptibility alleles, they almost all end up with personality disorders, and they turn out to be quite dangerous people. This is the combination. So it's not whether genes or environment determine who you are. The answer is they both do, but if you have all these susceptibility genes for these traits, let's say associated with psychopathy, violence, aggression, low empathy, all these, if you have those and you're abused, it's big trouble. It's big trouble for society. And so you see this in murders all the time, and we don't have the genetics of dictators, but this is how it looks. Now, if you don't have the genes for it, you grow up sometimes without even caring. It has no effect on you. These people are very resistant. These kids that fall down the stairs, they walk laughing, they walk away. There are people just wired. So the environment's really important if you have the genes. The other people who have this or are abused later, if they're abused late, let's say they're 8, 9, 10 years old, they're bullied later, or they see something awful, they see their family blow up, they can turn into sociopaths. But the difference is they don't have the problem with knowing morality. Psychopaths have no moral judgment whatsoever. They don't even think what they're doing is immoral, okay? Because the part of the brain that codes for that is not developed between birth and 2 or 3 years old, okay? And so if it happens later, you can be mad, and you can be angry, and you can get even with the world. You feel like you're a loner, and you're really ticked off at the world, and you may be wired this way. There's a good chance you could be a sociopath, but you know what you're doing is wrong, whereas a psychopath doesn't. In this funny way, sociopaths are evil, and psychopaths aren't, because psychopaths don't even think it's evil. They know you think it is, but they don't care. It's like a parking ticket to them. A murder is like a parking ticket. The other people who don't have the wiring for it, that is the genetics for it, who are abused, end up with PTSD. And so you have those people you can have not only a family which was PTSD runs, but you probably have whole cultures. And if you have recurring abuse, and whether it's in the Gaza or downtown LA, or in Russia for 400 years of Tsarist rule, you may have a whole country with too many people kind of with PTSD or psychopathy. And the person you choose to lead you may be somebody that answers the call of PTSD. And this is an idea, nobody's proven this yet, but this is the way it looks. And so the early childhood is the key. And I think in Putin's case, whether he was abandoned in Georgia or abused and bullied as a little kid in St. Petersburg kind of doesn't matter, as it turns out, because they're both the same thing. They're both early trauma. So that's kind of, that's something off the table because it's true even in his own words and everybody who knew about him. So here are the consistent personality traits in dictators. The first 4 or 5 are called pro-social traits. Now, the pro-social traits, it sounds like a good thing. So it's pro-social. It really means that they're adaptive and it makes you able to navigate society with ease. So you can navigate your way into different positions of power or where you're comfortable to abuse other people. So they're pro-social and people respond to it. And there's this thing called fearless dominance, a major group of psychopathic traits, but they're pro-social traits. And when people see this, what it appears to them as is charisma. When a person walks in the room, they got that light around them and they're charismatic. That is a huge psychopathic trait. But you can see how attractive it is to people, right? It's attractive, which is why these pro-social traits, not the antisocial, not the I'm going to kill you traits, because everybody sees that coming. The pro-social traits, fearless dominance, are the dangerous ones because you're really, these are the snakes in suits. And in that case, you have to ask yourself, for the specific question about Putin, does he have these pro-social traits, which would make him attractive to people? Even in light of the other things, which are more negative, which they're more the maladaptive, antisocial personality disorder traits, the further ones. Now, if you look at these are the consistent personality traits in dictators. This is also Robert Hare's exact list of traits of psychopaths. So that was the first thing that I guess surprised me, is that when listing these traits, and I said, I've seen this list before, it turns out to be the actual diagnostic list of traits for psychopathy. Now there's another group, and you'll have these in the sheet I had typed out. Now most all the dictators have these traits too. And they have a great need for stimulation. That may or may not be true for Putin. Socially deviant lifestyle, well, you tell me, for those of you who know. Abusive, sexually deviant. Now, some are sadistic. Not all dictators are sadists. And that has a special kind of wiring in the brain. And I'll show you where that is. There's a circuit for sadism and bullying that you find in almost all bullies and sadists. It's a little different. There's overlaps with psychopathy, but it's not diagnostic for psychopathy itself. Malignant narcissism is a term not used, but it's like the ultimate in a bad person, right? It's also part of what's called the dark tetrad. When you say dark tetrad to a psychologist, they get all really nervous, because this is about as bad as it gets. This is somebody you can't even be on the same block with. Insatiable appetites, excellent memories, terrible taste in art, and they marry poorly. When I saw this, went through all of them, even if they have access to good art, they choose really bad art. The sense of aesthetics is weird, and so that, I don't know what kind of art Putin likes. I've seen the mansion he made for himself, but I guess that's something. And they always marry somebody who is kind of not as smart as them. It's somebody you can lord over easily, right? It's just part of that pathology that can do your beck and call. For some reason, the classic thing about being the Napoleon complex turns out to be true. A lot of them are short, and a surprising number have like one bad arm. I don't know what that's about. It's like Dr. Strangelove. And so whether you're talking about Kaiser Wilhelm II or Stalin, I don't know about Putin. He has a funny thing. Anyway, there's some physical anomaly, and which probably makes them angry, and they need to get even to prove themselves. And that makes a lot of sense psychologically, so there's no big mystery there. But a lot of them have that. And then many have these narcissistic traits. These are narcissistic traits. I don't like these. I have some of these, so I don't like these. But a narcissistic personality disorder that's different than psychopathy. Psychopaths and malignant narcissists have overlapping symptoms. They have some core things. One has to do about a lack of emotional empathy. There's 4 kinds of empathy. I'll quickly say this at the end. I think I have out of time, though. And if we look at that, here is all the ways of creating a Venn diagram of what dictators have been called, and also, really what we consider evil people. There's a psychopath up at the upper right, sociopath, which is different, even though they can behave separately. And then there are these borderline psychopaths. The ones that you meet up with in your average life, the dangerous ones are the borderlines. They're not categorically psychopaths. They just score underneath the clinical level. And these are the ones that are going to get you. They're going to get you. And that's because, it's hard to run into like a categorical full-on psychopath unless he's your president. No. So here's the idea. There are 4 kinds, 2 axes of empathy. And everybody has a differing amount of these. And these are coded genetically, and they're represented differently in brain circuits. So this is kind of hardwired. One is between emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is what you want in a mate, and in a best friend. When they're happy, you're happy. When they're sad, you're sad. But a lot of people are not like that. It's like the mothers who don't connect with their kids. It's a normal thing. It's just part of the spectrum. The cognitive empathy is what psychopaths do have. And this is dangerous because they know how you feel, and they use it against you. They don't feel what you feel, but they know what you feel. But there are great people who had this sort of cognitive empathy. Nelson Mandela was one. Gandhi was one. Mother Teresa. These are people who are saving the world, but you don't want to be married with them and hang around because they're really prickly characters. They don't have no emotional empathy, but they do great things, so it's not bad. The other type of empathy is in-group and out-group empathy. So there's emotional versus cognitive empathy. People with cognitive empathy do a lot of great works, charity, etc. And you can see the next slide, there's the center of it. If you look right here in your brain, where I'm pointing to, it's called the anterior insula. And one part of that is the center of a circuit for emotional empathy, and the part right next door to it for cognitive empathy. Similar circuit, but they're coded for a little differently genetically in terms of connections. And you can see this, you do a PET scan on somebody, that reflects in their empathy. The in-group, out-group is important for determining voting patterns of people. If you're an in-group person, you're mostly going to vote for things that have to do with your own personal family. Everything's about your family, what's going to help them. Okay, this is probably why Trump won, is because a lot of people, under some stress, went to the default position because they're wild. I'm going to do what's best for my family, economically, et cetera. Then at the other end is the out-group empathy, and these are people who, like the Greens, who really honestly want to save the world. They love Gaia, they love all the children of the world, and sort of the honest Marxist who's nonviolent, which is their identity is with the entire world. And some people are just wired this way. People in the middle are nationalists. So these different kinds of empathy, the kind of person you are politically is reflected in this. So if you're a nationalist versus an internationalist versus just leave me alone, I want to stay at home person, is reflected in this kind of empathy. So here is areas of the brain of psychopaths. All the psychopaths we've ever looked at, these areas of the brain called the limbic system or emotional brain. It's right along the midline of the cortex. These are turned off in psychopaths. This is all emotional processing. If you look at narcissistic personality disorder, very similar, except it lacks in differences in the amygdala. And then dictator, if you put them all together, in a dictator, these are the areas that you'd probably see turned off in a lot of them. So it's the psychopath circuit plus the need for stimulation, almost an addiction circuit, plus that area up on top, the little blue spot that you see in sadists and bullies, or people who have been sadists or bullies. And then lastly, Putin's got this extra weird thing, kleptomania. He likes stealing things from people, and it's weird. And so there is one study that was done on kleptomaniacs, and there is another problem with the cortex. So I've added those red spots into the kleptomania. So this is what Putin's brain might look like if you, anyway, if you can talk him into getting an fMRI or PET scan done and for a big blood draw too. So I'll stop there and thank you.
The next session is starting now. There will be 2 sessions running at the same time. In this theater, we will be discussing Putin's wars. And in Theater 2, we have some amazing speakers, including Amy Knight, Andrei Soldatov, and Eric Toller, who will be talking about the killings of Vladimir Putin.